Now the last section in this module on logical storage is flex groups. As you probably know, by default, if you create a volume, it can never be larger than the size of the aggregate. So a volume cannot span aggregates. However, with flex groups, you can create a volume that runs multiple constituents in multiple aggregates. So that means that you can go up to a maximum size of 20 petabytes in your cluster of constituents spread out across aggregates. And by default, something to look into for the exam, by default, when you create a flex group, it defaults to 8 constituents per node. So if you create a very large volume, it will create 8 volumes per node in the aggregate that has most space. And that way it will give you an enormous amount of data space to put your files on. If you want to resize a flex group, you can do that by using the command volexpand. Or you can simply resize the flex group volume itself. So there's two ways of doing that. First, you could say I'm going to resize the volume. That means that it will resize all of the constituents. Or you can say I want to add more constituents to a flex group volume. You can do that by using the volexpand command. And also important, file sizes are limited to the size of the constituent. So if you put a file in such a volume, then the file should not be larger or bigger than the size of any of the constituents, because then it will not fit in the constituent. So your file sizes are limited to the size of the constituents. An example, creating a flex group by using flex group deploy, specify the storage virtual machine, and then specify the size will generate a number of constituents. And as you can see here, if you've got two nodes, each node has its own aggregate, data aggregate, then it will create 8 constituents in Agger 1 and it will create 8 constituents in Agger 2. Now this FG stuff on top here is the actual volume name. So you create the volume, and the volume, if you don't specify a name, it will by default start with FG. So it will tell you that there's a volume called FG, and this volume will have a number of constituents on which you can place the data. This is not an actual volume on disk, this FG. It is in the configuration of the cluster. Now let's have a look at that. So I prepared two commands again. Both commands will generate a flex group volume. First of all, let's have a look at our aggregates. We've got node 1, Agger 1, and we've got node 2, Agger 1. And both of these aggregates have around and about 35 gigabytes of available disk space. So these are the only two aggregates in our cluster, one per node, and we're going to run the flex deploy command first. As in the example on the slide, we're not going to specify name, we're just going to specify the size of the volume and the vServer in which we want to place it. So let's run it. When you run it, it will, of course, there's the export policy message again. You run it, it will tell you that it's going to create a number of constituents of 640 megabytes each. In total, 16 for the entire cluster, because we have two nodes, and as we discussed, it will be 8 per node, and it will place them in the aggregates. Now this will take some time because it has to create all the constituents. We're going to speed that up a little bit. So after it's created all the constituents, your volume is available. And let's have a look at the volume itself, and it tells you that there is a volume called FG. And as you can see, this FG volume does not have a place on any of the aggregates because it is in the configuration of the cluster. However, all of these 640 megabyte constituents belong to the FG volume. So it starts with 1 and it goes all the way down to 16. And then at the bottom there's the root volume. So we have a number of constituents to form one volume of the type flex group. Now let's offline it and then we can delete it because we want to create another one. So first we offline it, and when it's offline we can delete it. and do some more retention recovery queue purging. So we delete the volume FG, and it should be gone. But as we discussed, there is a retention queue, or recovery queue I should say, and when we look at the volume you see that all the constituents now have the type DEL, which means they're not really gone, but that will take about 12 hours to actually delete those volumes. But we want to get rid of that before 12 hours have passed, so we do the vol recovery queue, purge all, and specify the vserver or the SVM, and it will remove all of these constituents before 12 hours have passed. So we're back to where we were before we created the flex group. And now let's do it once more, but now with a different command. Now we're going to actually use the vol create command. Specify that we want to have two aggregates in which we place the constituents, and we want to use a multiplier of 8. That means that in total it will give us 16 constituents, and because we specify 8 per node. Well, again, the export policy, ignore it, and we speed up the creation of the constituents, and we're done. So now we've got another flex group volume that holds 16 constituents in this example. And when we show it, it tells us that we have the 640 megabytes constituents again. Now we go to admin mode. We don't see all of these constituents because we're no longer in diag mode, but they're actually, of course they're there, but they're not shown anymore. We simply see the FG volume and the size. Now let's expand that volume. So we can run the vol expand command and specify that we want to use both aggregates again, and the multiplier should be 8, which would give us another 16 constituents. In that volume it will create 16 constituents once more to actually give you more space in that flex group volume. Let's have a look at that, and we see that now we've got 20 gigabytes in size and 17.66 gigabytes available. And of course, for clients to access the volume, it should be mounted. So we mount the flex group volume to a junction path. Let's call it flex. Now let's check that. The field obviously is going to be junction path, and it tells us that it is mounted on /flex. Another way of querying this is by using the df-h command, specify the vserver, and it will tell you that it is mounted on flex. And we're done. Now I hope to see you back in the next module, which will be on networking.